John's alarm blared like a siren cutting through the quiet of his small, empty house. He rolled out of bed, his body moving through the motions on autopilot. Shower. Breakfast. Silence. The toast was burned again, but it didn't matter. Nothing did, really. His mornings were always like this, mechanical, lonely, predictable. The world outside was stirring, but John's life felt like it was frozen in a loop. The factory would be waiting, just as dull and unchanging as yesterday. The town hadn't changed either. Same cracked sidewalks, same tired faces. John trudged through the streets, head down, avoiding eye contact with the world around him. But deep down, there was a gnawing feeling, a void he couldn't explain. It wasn't sadness or despair exactly. It was emptiness, like something had been stolen from his life, and he couldn't even name what it was. He thought about Michael, his son, grown now, with a life of his own in the city. Michael came to visit once a month, punctual, polite, distant. They would sit on the porch, trading small talk like strangers on a train. Weather, work, the same old safe subjects. John wanted to reach out, to say something real, but the words never came. It was easier to let the moments slip by. That morning, as John walked to the factory, something unusual happened. A flash of red caught his eye. A small bird, vibrant and alive, landed on the fence beside him. It chirped 3 sharp notes, tilted its head as if studying him, and then took off into the sky. It was just a bird, John thought. But when it happened again the next day, and the day after that, something stirred. He couldn't explain it, but the bird felt like more than just a coincidence. Like it was a signal, though of what? He wasn't sure. Maybe it's a sign, he whispered under his breath, but then he shook his head. Signs weren't for people like him. Signs were for dreamers, for people with lives full of possibilities. Not factory workers with burnt toast and empty houses. But the bird had cracked something open, and for the first time in years, John began to wonder. Could there be something more? That weekend, Michael arrived, his car pulling into the driveway with its usual precision. He stepped out, his ties slightly loosened, a weariness in his eyes that John recognized all too well. "Hi, Dad," Michael said, offering a hug that felt brief, like it was fulfilling a duty more than a need. They sat at the kitchen table, eating lunch, another quiet meal filled with the familiar rhythm of small talk. "You look tired," Michael said, breaking the silence. John hesitated. "I guess I am." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Something bothering you?" For a moment, John thought about telling him, about the red bird, the strange feeling in his chest, the way the emptiness seemed to shift lately, like it was trying to say something. But the words felt clumsy, too big to fit into this space between them. "Oh, just life," John said instead, brushing it off with a half smile. He didn't want to burden his son, not when Michael seemed to carry the weight of the world already. Later that week, something even stranger happened. At the grocery store, as John scanned the shelves for the cheapest loaf of bread, a little girl appeared in front of him. Her tiny hand held a single yellow flower. She beamed up at him, eyes full of light and joy, and said, "For you." John blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," he said, but before he could say more, the girl had run back to her mother, her laughter echoing in the aisles. He stood there, staring at the flower, feeling something stir again. It wasn't just the flower, it was the moment itself. Simple, unassuming, yet it tugged at something deep inside him. These moments began to pile up, like puzzle pieces dropped in front of him, begging to be put together. A book left on a park bench caught his eye, Astor's The Simple Path, its worn cover calling out to him as if it had been placed there for him alone. A stranger, passing by, flashed a wide grin and said, "Have a wonderful day," as though they genuinely meant it. John wasn't used to these moments of connection, these cracks in the monotony of his life. It was like the universe was trying to nudge him awake, whispering something he was too afraid to hear. But he couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. Something was happening. Something was changing. And for the first time in years, John wondered if the answers he had been searching for weren't out there in the world but somewhere closer. Somewhere he hadn't dared to look. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, John sat on his porch with a mug of tea, staring out at the sky. The colors were vivid, pink bleeding into orange, fading into purple. The world seemed to hold its breath in those moments, everything bathed in soft, golden light. For the first time in years, John wasn't thinking about work or the quiet house behind him. He wasn't worrying about Michael or the questions he could never ask. He just sat there, letting the beauty of the sunset wash over him. Something inside him shifted, like a weight he'd been carrying forever had begun to lighten. The gnawing emptiness didn't disappear, but it softened, replaced by a sense of calm he didn't understand. For once, he wasn't fighting his thoughts or trying to make sense of them. He was just there, present. The memory of a story came to him then, something he'd read long ago. It was about standing in a forest, feeling the earth beneath your feet, and looking up at the towering trees. The story called it oneness, the feeling of being part of something bigger, of belonging. John hadn't thought about that story in years, but now it resurfaced, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Could it really be that simple, that all this time, the peace he'd been chasing wasn't something he had to find or achieve? It was something he already had, something buried beneath the noise of his thoughts, waiting to be uncovered. The next time Michael visited, John greeted him with a warmth that felt different, even to Michael. You see, I don't know. Different, Michael said as they sat on the porch, the tea steaming in their hands. John nodded, his smile soft but genuine. I've been trying something new, he said, noticing the little things. The way the sunset colors the sky, the sound of birds in the morning. It helps me feel connected. Michael frowned, skeptical. And that works, just looking at stuff, John chuckled. It's not about looking, Michael. It's about being. Just being there, without thinking about all the other stuff. Michael shook his head, a hint of impatience in his voice. I don't have time for that. Work's too busy. John didn't push. He just smiled, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. I used to feel that way too, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, unanswered. Michael didn't say much after that, but something in his father's tone lingered with him. It wasn't the usual small talk or platitudes. It was something deeper, something real. And as Michael drove back to the city that evening, the thought stayed with him, nagging at the edges of his mind. He didn't know why, but he felt like he had missed something important. Something he didn't quite understand yet. A few days later, John found himself wandering into the park, not quite sure why he'd gone there. The evening air was cool, the trees swaying gently as a soft breeze whispered through their leaves. He sat down on a bench near the pond, watching ducks glide across the water. The quiet was soothing in a way that felt new to him. As he sat there, an older man shuffled over and eased himself onto the bench beside him. He wore a battered hat and a serene expression, holding a small bag of breadcrumbs in his weathered hands. He began tossing crumbs to the birds, smiling as they fluttered down to peck at the ground. Beautiful day, isn't it? The man said, breaking the silence. John nodded. It is. The man turned to him, his eyes twinkling with the kind of wisdom that only comes from years of living. You look like a man with a lot on his mind. John hesitated, but then gave a faint shrug. I suppose I am. The man chuckled softly. Most people are. We spend so much time chasing answers, don't we? Looking for meaning, trying to fix everything, when sometimes. He paused, tossing another handful of crumbs. Sometimes the answers are right in front of us, and we're too busy thinking to see them. John stared at him, feeling as though the old man had reached inside him and plucked the words straight from his heart. I feel like I'm missing something, John admitted. But I don't know what it is. The man smiled, a kind, knowing smile. "Have you ever just watched a flower bloom?" he asked. John frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The man leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "I mean, just sitting there, not thinking about what kind of flower it is or how long it will last. Not trying to figure it out. Just watching it, seeing it for what it is. When you do that, you don't just see the flower, you see yourself too." John didn't know how to respond. He sat there, turning the words over in his mind as the old man stood up, brushing crumbs off his hands. "Try it," the man said with a wink. "You might be surprised at what you find." That evening, John went home and sat in his garden. The sky was darkening, the stars beginning to peek out one by one. In the faint glow of the porch light, his eyes landed on a small flower growing by the fence. He knelt down, leaning in close, and for the first time, he really looked at it. The delicate petals were soft, their edges curling just slightly. The colors were vibrant, shifting subtly as the breeze made them sway. He wasn't thinking about what kind of flower it was or how long it would last. He wasn't thinking at all. And in that moment, something washed over him. A stillness, a peace that felt almost sacred. It wasn't just the flower he saw. It was the beauty of being present, of letting go of the endless stream of thoughts and worries that usually consumed him. It was the quiet realization that the missing piece he'd been searching for wasn't out there in the world. It was here, inside him. Always had been. For the first time in what felt like forever, John wasn't chasing answers. He was simply being. And it was enough. The next time Michael visited, John was already waiting for him on the porch, the same soft smile on his face. As Michael stepped out of the car, there was something different in his father's eyes, a quiet calm, a steadiness that felt almost unshakable. "Hey, Dad," Michael said, walking up the steps. "You look well." John chuckled. "I feel well." They sat together, as they always did, tea steaming between them. But the silence wasn't the same this time. It wasn't heavy or strained. It felt open, unhurried. Michael noticed it, though he couldn't quite put it into words. "What's changed?" Michael asked finally, breaking the quiet. John looked out at the yard, where the flowers swayed in the breeze, their colors glowing in the late afternoon light. "I've been paying attention to the small things," he said. "The way the sun feels on my face, the way birds sound in the morning, even the way the tea tastes when it's just right." Michael raised an eyebrow, half amused. "So, what? You just watch flowers and listen to birds now, and that fixes everything?" John smiled. "Not fixes, Michael. It's not about fixing anything. It's about noticing what's already here. Letting go of all the noise in your head and just being present." Michael shook his head, the skepticism clear in his expression. "That's nice, Dad, but I've got deadlines, meetings, people relying on me. I don't have time to sit around staring at the sky." John didn't push. He just sipped his tea, his smile never wavering. "Maybe that's when you need it the most," he said quietly. Michael didn't respond. He changed the subject, steering the conversation back to the safe, familiar topics they always talked about. But later, as he drove back to the city, John's words lingered in his mind. "Maybe that's when you need it the most." The days turned into weeks, and the visits became fewer. Michael was busy, always busy. And John, well, he had found his rhythm in the simplicity of his days. He walked to the park, sat on his porch, and watched the sunsets with a sense of peace that no longer felt fleeting. He had stopped searching for meaning and had started simply living. And then, one morning, John didn't wake up. Michael got the call during a meeting. The words hit him like a punch to the chest, the air rushing out of his lungs. He dropped everything and drove straight to the small town, the road blurring as his mind swirled with memories and regrets. He hadn't called in weeks, hadn't visited, and now it was too late. The funeral was quiet, attended by neighbors who spoke kindly of John, sharing stories about his gentle demeanor and the way he'd seemed so content in his final years. Michael barely heard them. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the silence his father had left behind. After the service, Michael returned to the house, the small, quiet house that now felt even emptier. He wandered through the rooms, touching the worn furniture, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. On the kitchen table, he found a journal, its leather cover worn and soft. Opening it, Michael began to read. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, simple reflections, thoughts, and observations. One entry caught his eye. Today I sat and watched a flower bloom. I felt connected to everything around me. The worries and fears faded away. I wish Michael could feel this peace. Michael closed the journal, his hands trembling. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't wipe them away. Instead, he stood, walked outside, and found the garden where his father had spent so much time. The flowers were still there, vibrant and alive. He knelt down, just as John had, and stared at a single bloom. At first, his mind was loud, racing with thoughts of work, deadlines, and all the things he should be doing instead. But slowly, as he focused on the flower, the way its petals curved, the way it swayed so gently in the breeze, his thoughts began to quiet. For the first time, Michael understood. The peace his father had found wasn't in the flower. It wasn't in the sunsets or the birds or the tea. It was in the act of being present, of letting go of the endless noise and simply existing in the moment. The weight in his chest lightened. The ache of regret softened. For a brief moment, Michael felt something he couldn't quite describe. Connection, stillness, peace. And as he sat there, watching the flowers sway in the evening light, he whispered to himself, "I think I get it now, Dad." In the days that followed, Michael lingered in the small town longer than he had planned. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. He spent his time walking the paths his father must have walked, sitting on the porch where they used to talk, and visiting the bench by the pond. Every place held echoes of John's life, the peace he'd discovered, the quiet joy he had found in the simplest moments. Michael sat on the bench where the old man had once spoken to his father, tossing crumbs to the birds just as he imagined John had done. He wondered about that man. If he'd been a stranger, a guide, or just someone who had figured out the same truths his father had. The sunsets became a ritual for Michael. He watched them each evening, letting the colors fill the sky and his heart. At first, it felt like he was trying to be like his father, but slowly it became his own practice, his own way of finding peace. The city, with its noise and rush, felt far away, and for the first time in years, Michael wasn't in a hurry to get back to it. Before he left, he packed up the journal to take with him, but not before writing something of his own in the final pages. "Dad, I get it now. It's not about chasing happiness or fixing what's broken. It's about being here, being part of the world without trying to control it. Thank you for showing me that, even if it took me too long to understand." When Michael returned to the city, he was different. He still worked hard, still faced deadlines and pressure, but he made time every day to pause. He watched the sunrise in the mornings. He listened to the birds outside his window. He took small walks without his phone, just noticing the world around him. Slowly, the peace he'd found in his father's garden began to spread into the rest of his life. One day, a coworker stopped him in the break room. "You seem happier lately," they said. "What's your secret?" Michael smiled, remembering his father's soft chuckle, the way he had answered questions without pushing. "It's simple," he said. "I just take time to notice the little things." The coworker laughed. "That's it, just noticing stuff," Michael nodded. "You'd be surprised how much it changes everything." They shrugged, unconvinced, but Michael didn't mind. He knew the truth wasn't something you could explain. It was something you had to experience. That night, as Michael sat by his window, watching the lights of the city flicker against the dark sky, He thought of his father again. He could almost hear John's voice, calm and steady, like the last lines of the journal. When we stop searching and simply be, we realize the peace we were looking for was always there. Michael smiled to himself, a quiet, knowing smile. His father's lessons hadn't just changed his life, they had become part of him. And as he sat there, content in the moment, he felt a connection that time and distance could never break. Because sometimes, the greatest gift a person can leave behind isn't wealth or achievements. It's the simple, profound understanding of how to live.